clear. So today I will explain Class 10th History Chapter 4, and our chapter is the Age of Industrialization. So the Age of Industrialization. Now in this chapter we are going to look at the Age of Industrialization, the time period where industrialization, the process of industrialization started in the whole world, begin in the whole world. So basically in this chapter we are going to discuss about the industrialization from two perspectives. Now we will look at the Britain from the Western perspective and to the Indian perspective as well. Now Britain, as also know, that is the first industrial nation of the world. So that's why we will look at the case of Britain, and after that we will look from the Indian perspective as well. So in this chapter all over we are going to discuss about the industrialization. Now in the starting of the chapter there are two images given in your book. Now first one is the dawn of the century painted by E.T. Paul as the cover of his music album, and was painted in 1900 in New York City. Now in this picture, in this image, you could see, if you had your book, you could see that there is a goddess-like figure who is the angel of progress, and she is standing on a wheel with wings, showing the time, that is she is flowing towards the future. And behind her you could see that all those signs, symbols of progress like railways, engines, you could say camera, press, and all those things are shown as the progress. Now the whole image is shown as an era of the progress, the dawn of the century, meaning the new era, the beginning of the new era. So that is shown in the first figure. Now second figure is of the two magicians. Now the two magicians figure that was painted in 1901 in the England, you could say that in the England. Now there in the first part, in the upper part, you could say that there was Aladdin, who is from the Orient countries. Orient countries means that Orient countries are those countries that are in the eastern part of the Mediterranean. That generally refers to the Asian countries. Now as often Aladdin, that is a fantasy from the Orient countries. Now he is holding his lamp, and from that he is showing that from the magic he built all those palaces, castles, all those cities. And below that there is a mechanic, there is a worker mechanic, and is holding his weapon, and from that weapon it is showing that he built all that industries and all those progress, the technological change, the industrial growth. Now it is showing that first one is just magic, nothing else, but now second one is a real magic, how the world has changed, how it kept pace with the industrial growth. So all this we are going to discuss in this chapter about how the industrial growth is associated with all these images or figures, you could say. Now in this chapter we will look about the industrialization, how it started, when it started, and you could see that the pace of the industrialization, what was the speed in which it was growing. Now let's start our chapter without any further ado with our first topic, that is before the Industrial Revolution. So before the Industrial Revolution, now you know what, that when we talk about the industrialization, people just think that we are talking about the factories, the factory production. When we talk about the industrial production, they just think of the factory production, that is the production that is produced in the factories. When we talk about the industrial workers, they think that all those workers in the factories. And we talk about the industrialization, they think about the factory industries. So that is about the industrialization. But even before than that, when there was a large scale production for the international market, it was being produced, but not with the fact of industries or factories. It was produced in the proto-industrial period. Now all that period in which there was a large scale production for the international market was known as the proto-industrial period or proto-industrialization by the historians, because even in that period there was even still a very good production, but you could say that without any technological growth or without any technological support, and that's why it is known as the proto-industrial period. As you could say, proto, that means the initial starting of anything or something, you could say. So it was the starting of industrialization, but not with an industrial growth or technology. So that was a period of proto-industrial, a proto-industrial period, you could say. Now in that period, what was happening now? You could say that all those industries already began to grow in the late 18th century, and even before than that in 17th and in 18th century, all those merchants from the towns went to rural areas for giving work or for giving advances to the peasants and artisans. Now what was happening that they could not compete with all those urban traders, all those traders that were in the urban areas or in towns, because they had monopoly rights that were given, that were, you could say that, granted by the crown of Britain, the government of Britain, and that's why they could not compete with them in the urban areas, and that's why they looked for work, they looked for giving work to the all those peasants and artisans in the rural areas. As also know that by that period all those peasants and artisans, all those open fields were now being enclosed. Now all those peasants and artisans were looking for the alternative source of income, and when all those merchants came from the towns to the rural areas for giving work, as also noted for textile work, for giving them the textile work to produce a shirt out of cotton or produce any clothes, any, you could say that, ready-made clothes from any fabric or from any, you could say that, from any fiber, you could say. So they went to the rural areas, gave advances to all those peasants and artisans, and even those peasants and artisans, when they received all those advances, they just started to work for all those merchants. And as also noted before, in that proto-industrial period there was a very long process. Even today there is a long process of making clothes out of fiber, but it took very much time compared to the present time in the proto-industrial period. Now what was happening that whenever there was a fiber, first a yarn would be made or a thread will be made out of that fiber, and that would be done by a person in one place. Now then merchant would take it and would go to the another place. Now there it would be made as a fiber, a fabric, you could say. Now merchant would take that fabric to the other person, to the other, you could say, market, and there it would be made as a shirt. Now when it is made as a shirt, then he will go. Now merchant will take it and would go to another market for finishing it, for giving them even more good looks. And after that he would go to the dyers where that cloth would be dyed, where that shirt would be dyed, would be colored in very colorful colors or any colors, you could say. And after that finally it would go to the finishers who would give a very beautiful finishing to that shirt, and finally it would go to the international market to be sold in the international market, as the demand was growing for the colonies as well. Now you could say that all this process took a long time, and even for a little process, you could say that for one process, for each process there were 20 to 25 workers hired by the merchants to that single process. So you could say that for a merchant there were around 100 to 150 workers who were hired for making a shirt, for making shirts out of fibers, you could say. So that was the proto-industrial growth. The proto-industrial period, you could say, that was before the industrialization, before the industrial revolution. As also known as industrialization, that brought a very big or great, you could say, revolution. So before that there was proto-industrial period in which there was like that, the situations were going like this. Now our next subtopic is the coming up of the factory. So the coming up of the factory. Now, as I've already said that there was a proto-industrial period, but after that they were coming up the factories. Factories were coming up, and the first ever factory that grew up, or you could say that the starting factories, the first ever factories that were growing in Britain were in 1730s. Now the symbol of the new era for the industrialization was cotton. From the textile industry it was cotton. Now you could say that the starting all over the first industries or factories that were being grown, that were growing, were of all the cotton. And now technologies were being introduced to the people, and that helped the people a lot, because with those machines, with the help of all those machines, they could now produce the same amount of shirt in a very, you could say, a little time compared to the earlier period. Now all those processes of dyeing, spinning, cudling, all those processes were now being done, and all those machines also, you could say, increase the capability of per worker, of each worker, you could say. So you could say that was the introducing phase of all those factories of cotton. Now that was the starting of the cotton, and after that the cotton mill, that was, you could say, that introduced by Richard Arkwright. He made the cotton mill you could say that by himself, and after that you could say that all those processes that were being done now were being done in just just under one roof. As I've already said, that for all those processes, a merchant had to go to many markets, to many shops for all the processes to be done. But now in a cotton mill, all those processes were being done under the same roof. As I've said that earlier, you already know that there was a spindle, and with each spindle at a time you could make one thread. But now there could be hundreds or thousands spindles, threads that could be made out of one single spindle. So that was being done in the cotton mills. That helped the people a lot. And you could say that earlier in 1760, around 1770, in that period there was a total cotton import in Britain was about 2.2 million pounds, but it increased to 22 million pounds in 1787. So you could say that increased from 2.2 million pounds to 22 million pounds. That means there was a very large demand for the raw material, for the raw cotton, you could say. That was, you could say that, imported from the colonies like India or any other countries, and thus it was made as a, you could say, a cloth, a shirt or any t-shirt, you could say, from any cloth, and then it would be exported to the international market, to the colonies, to make money. So that was being done in Britain, and you could say that was the starting, that was the coming of the earlier factories. You could say that those all factories started in 1730, but only at the late 18th century did they start growing. In the 19th century or in the late 18th century did they start growing by all the people, accepted by all the people. But still you could say that now those all people were accepting all those cotton mills or all those technology, but still in workshops or at the local worker, the work was being done of the textile, of the cotton, you could say. Now our next subtopic is the pace of industrial change. So the pace of industrial change. Now if we talk about the pace of industrial change, then do you think that there was a very rapid industrial change? The pace of industrial change was very rapid. Let's discuss about it. Now first of all, there were mainly two, you could say that, industries that were dominating in Britain, that were of iron and steel and the cotton. Now the first phase of industrialization till 1840s, now there was cotton. Cotton, that was a symbol of new era, because its production was so much, was the most in Britain for exporting it. Now what would happen was that by 1840s, cotton was dominating in the industries, but after that with the expansion of railways in 1840s in Britain and in 1860s in colonies like India, there was more and more demand of iron and steel as well, and that's why after 1840s, iron and steel industries were now dominating. So you could say that these two industries, that were the cotton and the cotton textile industries and the iron or steel industries, now these two were the most, you could say, that dominating industries in Britain for the industrial growth, for the pace of industrial growth. And after that, if you look at the figure, you could say that iron and steel industries by 1873, its total export was about 77 million pounds, was worth of 77 million pounds, which was just double of that of cotton, export. So you could say that it also had a very great contribution for the pace of industrial growth or the industrial change. Now after that, second factor you could say about industrial growth was that even by the late 19th century, you could say that all those technological machines or technology could not easily replace all those traditional methods, all those, you could say, that the work that was done by the man folds. Now what would happen that even by the late 19th century, you could say that around even less than 20% of the total workforce of Britain was working in the, you could say, the technological industrial areas, technological in industries where there were machines, you could say. So you could say that in all those technological industries, there were very less people who are working, because all the force were working in the traditional method, in the method that they were doing. So you could say that it also mattered for the pace of industrial growth or industrial change. Now third matter could be that all those, you could say that all those traditional methods or the non-mechanized sector were also innovating themselves by other things, not but just textile work. There were many other works that were being done in the non-mechanized sector, that were the pottery, the furniture making, and all those things that could not be made out of the machines. So that was being done in the non-mechanized sector as well. Now fourth factor could be that all those technological changes occurred very slowly. Now you could say that they were occurring very slowly, you could say, were not spreading that much among the people. You could say that whenever a thing spreads too much, then there will be everywhere gossip about it and people would just talk about it. So you could say that all those technological changes weren't that much spreading, but occurring very slowly. Like for example, the steam engine. Now steam engine, as all of you know, that was invented, or you could say that revised by James Watt, and after that his friend, you could say that Matthew Boulton, also invented the new pattern, or you could say the new device, new version of that steam engine. But even after the 19th century, there were total 380 steam engines present in England. Out of those, 80 were in cotton textile industries and 9 were in the woolen industries, and after that all the rest remaining, you could say, were in the canal works, in mining, or in any other work. So you could say that all these changes were occurring very slowly, as we have seen that all those steam engines weren't used that much because it was occurring very slowly, very slowly among the people. You could say that all those merchants and all those who were investing their capital, who are doing capital investment in the industries, were now looking for the workforce, not for the machines, because first of all, machines were very costly, and after that you could say that all merchants had to use it very properly, with, you could say that, with so much cautions. And that's why all those machines, because all those machines often broke and it took a lot of money to be repaired. All those machines needed a lot of money to be repaired. So that was costing too much money for all those merchants or all those industrialists, and that's why they were now focusing, they were now going to all those workforce, to workers to work in their industries instead of all those machines. So these are all the factors that affected the pace of industrial growth. You can't just say that just by an overnight there was a very rapid industrialization or the industrial growth. It took a lot of time for industrial growth to be, you could say that, as we see it today. It wasn't that earlier. So there was a long process among the people and among the industries, you could say. Now our next topic is hand labor and steam power. So hand labor and steam power. Now if we talk about the hand labor, what about hand labor? What about the workers in Britain? Now you know what, that in Victorian Britain, now in Britain, when there was a Victoria rule, you could say in Victorian Britain there wasn't any kind of shortage of number of workers. You could say that a plenty of workers were present there, and that's why they were all present in the villages, you could say, in rural areas, and they were coming to the cities, you could say, in the search of work. And as all of you know that when there are a lot of number of workers, then obviously automatically all those wages are low, all those wages come down, and that's why industrialists had no problem. Now they were hiring many workers for the industries instead of, you could say that, very costly machines. So they were now hiring all those workers. You could say that all those workers, because there were a lot of workers in Britain, in the Victorian Britain, and the wages were also very low, and that's why industrialists preferred them. Now you could say that in most of the industries, all those work done by workers was seasonal, like the gas industries or breweries. Now they wanted the labor, hand labor, in the months of winter, and the same goes to all those bookbinders and all those catering to the Christmas. They wanted all those hand labor in the month of December, before December, you could say. So you could say that those wanted the seasonal hand labor, and that's why they preferred all those workers instead of machines, because if you buy machine at a time, then it has to be, you could say that, it has to be established in the industries for all 12 months, and with a very costly, you could say, all those repairing costs as well. So you could say that all those industries were now preferring all those workers, or you could say that in another language, hand labor instead of steam power. Now what was happening was that in Victorian Britain, now people were preferring, as all of you know that in industries, in machines, not just in industries, in machines, all those those works that were done, all those clothes that were made were standardized. You could say that it's standardized. All those were in the same design, and all those were for the international market. But in the market, what people wanted, that specific designs, intricate designs, specific shapes, you could say. Now anybody would want a very unique dress or very unique design, you could say, but that was not given by the machines, and that's why hand labor was preferred more and more. And in Victorian Britain, not just in Victorian Britain but all in the Britain, what was happening was that all those upper class people like aristocracies and all those upper class people were now preferring handmade clothes, because handmade clothes was the symbol of refinement, was a symbol of very upper class people, you could say. So you could say that in other language, all those upper class people or high caste people were now referring to handmade clothes that were made by the hand labor, because by hand they could have their own design, and it was a symbol of refinement and cost as well. So now they were buying all those handmade clothes. So that was the situation of Victorian Britain. Now people were looking, as they were, you could say that in Victorian Britain, around the mid-19th century. In mid-19th century, there were 500 varieties of hammers and around 45 varieties of axes. So that couldn't be produced by the help of machines. As all of you know that in machines there can't be that much variety. There would be cloth and there would be just several copies of it in less time, but there won't be that much intricate design or specific shapes or any specific design, you could say. So that was the situation of hand labor in Britain. Now let's discuss about the situation of workers with our next subtopic, that is life of the workers. So the life of the workers. Now as we have seen about the hand labor of the workers, you could say that all those workers that were doing were in the Victorian Britain, as there were a lot of number of workers. Now let's discuss about the life of workers. As there was an abundance labor, in Britain, now what was happening was that all those workers, all those peasants, artisans and all those workers who were searching for the job now went from the rural areas to the cities in search of jobs. Now they were likely to get a job in an industry or factory. Even you could say that in most cases it was seen that if you had any kind of relation, if there was a friend of yours or a relative of yours that was doing work in that factory already, then there would be more and more chance of your getting employed in that factory. As in simple that if you had relation in that factory even by a friend or relative, then there would be more and more chances of your employment. But still not everyone had connection in those factories or industries, and that's why many workers had to wait for weeks and had to spend nights under the bridges or in the night refuges maintained by the private individuals or by any labor committee. So they were spending their time in search of employment, in more and more search of employment. Now I could say that in another language there were many employment opportunities, but there were more and more number of workers as well, and that's why it was hard to give them employment as well. So that was the situation of unemployment in Britain as well. Now you could say that if you talk about the life of the workers, now they were getting, even you could say that even if they were getting wages, then the problem was that seasonal work, seasonal hand labor. Now what was happening was that in Britain most of the workers were employed just for 2 months or for 10 days for work, as the work was seasonal, but after that they would just go to the streets again looking for jobs, or many of them returned to their homes, to the rural areas. So you could say that all those people who came for the looking of job, now they were returning back to the rural areas, as they saw that they were getting job but for seasonal employment, you could say. And the thing that mattered most to them was that not just wage rate, they wanted a secured employment for whole whole year, you could say. So they wanted a secured employment. As if we can see the situation of workers in the Napoleonic Wars in the early 19th century. Now what was happening was that in Napoleonic Wars, as all of you know, that the prices of all those goods were now rising. Now you can see in many books that in the early 19th century the wages of all those workers had arisen, but the fact that was hidden from all the books is that the fluctuating of all those years. Now you have arisen, you have increased the wages of all those workers, but in the next year in the Napoleonic Wars the prices of goods were also increased so much, so there was a very much gap between the workers and all those prices of goods, and that's why they couldn't afford it anymore. And if we talk about the time period of 1830s, when there was an economic slump, now there was an unemployment rate between 35% to 75%. So you could say that was very high rate of unemployment. Now that was by being done in Victorian Britain, you could say, at the time of economic slump and at the time of employment. Now many people were looking for the work, but you could say that was the life of the workers. They had to spend so much nights, so much days for looking for a job, and even if they got a job, then there was uncertainty in that job. So that was the life of workers. Now as there was so much rate of unemployment. Now what was happening was that whenever there was introduction, all those workers became hostile with the invention of new machines, with the invention of new methods of technology in the industries. As all of you know, they were not against the industries, but all those technological ways that were being used in the industries, all those machines that were getting rid of all those workers. Like for example, when spinning jenny was introduced, all those women who were doing hand spinning earlier than that were now so outraged, and that's why they attacked all those spinning jennies warehouses where they were stored, you could say. So you could say that all those workers who now had become hostile to all those machines that were being invented, that were being introduced to the people, to the industrialists. But after that, in around the time period of 1840s, as all of you know that after that there was with a railway expansion, many opportunities came for all those workers in the construction sites, for railway expansion, for the railway stations, for digging the tunnels, and for all those work, for the canals, and for all those sewage ponds, you could say. So you could say that after mid-19th century, there were more and more opportunities that were coming for all those Victorian Britain workers, all those workers that were Britain. So you could say that was the life of workers, and we have seen about the Western perspective. Now our next topic is industrialization in the colonies. So the industrialization in the colonies, as we have seen from the Western perspective, now we have seen about the Britain, and we have seen it from the Western perspective about the industrialization by the workers, the condition of workers, because in Britain the most affected people were the workers about the industrialization, but in India there were other people like the weavers who were most affected by the industrialization. So let us look at the Indian textile industries, Indian industrialization, about the colony. As all of you know that during that time India was a colony under Britain. So we will discuss about the industrialization in India with a subtopic that is the age of Indian textiles. So the age of Indian textiles. Now before machine industries, India dominated the international market in silk and cotton textiles. Now as we already have studied about the cotton textiles, you know what, that coarser cottons were produced in many countries, but finer varieties of cotton were mainly produced in India. So before machine industries, India had a very great export, a very great name in the international market about the textile industries, and mainly in cotton and silk. Now there was a very big network about this. Now you could say that export in the international market, there were many people who were linked, who were interconnected for the export of all those goods from India to any other country in the international market. Now there were many, you could say that from large, there were Armenian and Persian traders who exported the goods from the Punjab to Afghanistan and Persian countries and the Middle East Asia. Now Middle Asia, you could say. And after after that there were other people who were doing from the northwest frontier. There were also exports of goods from India, from via the mountain passes and all those desert passes. So from northwest frontier also there were many exports. There were goods export from India to other countries. Now those were from the land, but there were ports as well. Now from ports, by the sea routes, there were also trades. There were also exports from India. Now as we talk about the exports, main ports of India, then there would be Surat on the Gujarat coast that connected to the Red Sea routes and many other routes. And after that there were Hooghly in Bengal, and there were Masulipatam on the Coromandel coast. Now they connected to the Southeast Asian countries. So those were the sea routes for the export of goods from India to other countries, for exports of goods from India. Now as I've said that there was a very big network, many people were interlinked in this export. Now many people were giving, many people were in this network, like for example the financing credits, banks involvers, you could say bank involved in this for giving the credits. And after that there were supporter exporters and financing supporters, and all those people who were connected in this network of export of goods from India. Like for example, all those exporters, all those all those connectors, all those merchants, big merchants, what they did was that for now they gave advances to the inland regions that were very far from the ports, and from inland regions they give advances to peasants and artisans, to the weavers, and all those weavers wove all those clothes, all those cotton textiles and silk clothes. And after that all those merchants, all those exporters, you could say, would go to the ports, and there would be big shippers and all those big merchants who wanted to export all those clothes to their countries. Now there would be negotiation of prices, and after that merchant would give to the big shippers all those goods, and then it would be exported to other countries. So there was a very big network of this export, but because in that there was transportation, there was financing by the banks, but this network controlled by Indians was breaking down by 1750s. Now what happened that European countries were now had gained power in India by concessions made by the courts, by having the monopoly rights over trade, and by that now all those earlier pre-colonial ports were now being declined, like the Surat on Gujarat and Hooghly port. Hooghly, you could say, in Bengal were now declined, were now breaking down, you could say, because you know what, that after Britishers came in India, the ports that grew were in Bombay and in Calcutta. So those two were the ports where there was so much export from India, trade from India by Britishers, not by the Indians that much. Now you would be surprised to know that because in the last years of the 17th century there was a trade about 16 million rupees, but after that by 1740s it decreased to 3 million rupees. So all those banks, all those local banks went bankrupt, and all those Indian textile trade were now declined, had now broken down, because all those power had been gained by the European countries, European companies, you could say, by the British companies. Now our next subtopic is what happened to the weavers. So what happened to weavers? Now if we talk about the East India Company, when it came to India and gained power, now all exports fell from India. But initially from 1760s, from 1750s you could say, now there wasn't that much falling of exports from India. Still there was a very great demand for Indian textiles, Indian clothes, Indian woven clothes. As also know that there was a very great quality, good quality of Indian textiles, of woven cloth of India, and that's why there were still a very large number of great demand for all those Indian textiles in the international market. It was only due to the political power that was gained by East India Company that all those exports fell from India. Now you know what, that in Bengal and in Carnatic region in 1770s, during the time period of 1770s only, the East India Company gained official power. But before that, what was happening in India, that all those British officials, all those East India Company officials were now facing problems problem in India, as they had to face a lot of competition in Indian market, as there were Dutch people, Portuguese people and French people and the local Indian merchants. So they were facing a lot of competition among them, and there were high prices for all those company officials as well. So now they were facing a lot of competition and there were high prices as well. Now many letters were sent by the company officials back to the London complaining all those high prices and all those you could say that all those competition in Indian market. Now after that, in 1770s and in 1780s, when East India Company gained official power, gained political power in India, now it had the right to monopoly rights and all those power to dominate itself in the Indian market. Now what happened after it gained power? Let's discuss about it first. Now first what happened was that now it gained the monopoly rights. It decreased all the competitions in the Indian market by having all those monopoly rights, so that all those Indian local merchants, all those French people, Dutch or Portuguese people wouldn't have any type of competition with all those British officials with that company. So you could say that it decreased all that competition in the Indian market, having all those exports fell from Britain to India. And after that, all those weavers, all those local weavers who were from India, now all those company officials were seeing them as a problem, and that's why they were not turning themselves as the buyer for all those weavers. Now one of the great way of doing that was giving them advances. Now they were giving, all those company officials were giving them advances for buying their raw for the production, and there was a condition for giving them that credit, that they would sell it to the British, to the Britain company, that East India Company. Now obviously they were selling it to the Britain company, that company, but with a very miserably low prices. Now what happened was that the company hired an official, that was a gomasta for all the villages, for each village for each gomasta. Now those gomastas' main work was to supervise all those weavers and make them sell all those clothes to the company at all. Now to only the company, you could say. So main work of the gomasta was just like was of the supply merchants. But you know what, that often there was a news that they were clashing between the villagers, between the weavers and the gomastas. Now what happened was that earlier there were supply merchants, and supply merchants weren't forcing them to sell to each buyer. Now what happened, that all those weavers were free to choose their buyer at a very good price, but now they weren't receiving any kind of good price from the Britain company, and they were living a very miserable life, as they were tied to the company from those loans advances that were given by the British company. Now what happened was that earlier there were supply merchants who were helping all those weavers, as they were their own relatives. Now they were helping them in the time of crisis, and they were very good to them. But those gomastas who were outsiders were now being arrogant and often took sepoys around. Sepoys is also know that English substitute word for the sipai. So all those sepoys often used to beat all those weavers. So all those sepoys or all those gomastas used to beat all those weavers and make them work on time and very low time as well. Their deadlines were also very short, you could say. So you could say that there were also very great difference. That was the situation of weavers. Now earlier they could sell their production with any buyer with a very good price, but after that now they were monopolized. They were facing so much competition, as all those goods from British companies were very cheap, that were imported to India. Now what happened was that all those weavers who had land to do agriculture. Now many weavers had land to do agriculture as well, but they had to look for the alternative source of income as well. Now because of all those rights that were given, that were occupied by the company, by the East India Company, what was happening that they now had to do just the weaving work. And you know that all that weaving process took a lot of time, and all family members, from children, from women to men, were engaged in many processes of weaving clothes. Now for the conclusion, you could say that all those weavers, many of the weavers deserted the villages, went to another villages to set up their looms, where they had some relation, where they had some family relation, and many of them also revolted against all those British officials, but you know that they were suppressed as well. So that happened to the weavers. Now our next subtopic is Manchester comes to India. So Manchester comes to India. Now what do you mean by that heading? Now you know that Manchester comes to India means that Manchester, that was the first place in Britain where the industries were set up. Now you could say that very industrial area in Britain. Now you know what, that there wasn't any kind of export, as all of you know that from Britain. Now weavers in India were facing many problems. Now they were facing problem of export to other countries in international market. Now in Britain, as all of you know that there were many industries that were set up, and that's why all those industrialists were now forcing the government to ban any kind of import from any countries of textiles, as they had to sell their own production. So from India there wasn't any kind of export to Britain at all now. And after that, you know that in many other countries also the exports fell off because of the Britain countries. And even moreover, what happened that in addition to that, all those Britain industries were also now asking the East India Company to sell their production in India. Now you know what, that by 1811 to 1812 there was 33% of export from India, but it decreased to 3% in 1850s. So you could say that a very great fall of export, the exports rate from India, and there was a very increased rate of import in India as well. Now even before that, in 17th century, in 18th century, there wasn't any kind of import in India of textiles, but after that there was a lot of imports in India by 1870s. You know what, that all those productions from Britain were now imported in India. And that's why all those weavers had to face problem, because all those imports, all those clothes, all those production were machine made goods, and that's why they were very cheap. So now people would obviously prefer all those clothes. As I've already said that machine goods weren't that much preferred in Britain, but they were preferred in the colonies as they were very cheap. So that's why people weren't buying those items, those clothes that were sold by the weavers, because weavers' clothes were very expensive, because they had to do work for many days and nights, and all that family was engaged in that single cloth, and that's why they had to sell in very expensive prices. But now people were preferring all those imported goods, and there was a lot of import in India as well. By 1870s, around 50% of total in the production was imported. That was earlier 0%, virtually no import from any countries, but now there was a lot of imports in India, and that led to the decline work of the weavers. Now another thing was that weavers weren't also getting any kind of raw material, any kind of raw cotton. Now what happened that in Britain, all those supplies of raw cotton were from America, but because of civil war that broke into the America, all those exports of raw cotton to Britain was now cut off, and that's why Britain turned to India. All those raw material, raw cotton, were now imported from India to Britain, and that led to the problems to weavers as well at all. You could say that because there were high prices of all those raw cotton that could not keep pace with the wages, with the income of all those weavers. Now what was happening that all that raw cotton was now exported to the Britain, all those merchants were now exporting it to the Britain, and that's why in India there wasn't that much supply of raw cotton in the Indian markets, and that's why all those prices went so much high, and that got to the problems to the weavers. So you could say that in India we were facing two main problems, that they were so much import that they could not keep pace with that. There was so much competition for them, their work wasn't sold that much, and after that they couldn't get that much raw cotton as all. But even after that there was still many problems, like the factories coming up in India that led flooding in the market. So that let's discuss about it with our next topic, that is factories come up. So factories come up. Now you know what, that after 1854, around the time period of 1815, now there were many factories that were being established in India as well. Now many factories now were started in India, like in 1854 the first cotton mill was established in Bombay, and it also started its production after 1 year. And after that many factories, like in 1874 there were many factories that were being established at Calcutta, and the first jute mill also started at the time period of 1855 in Kolkata, and after 7 years there were another. Now it was started in Bengal, not in Kolkata, and after that many factories, like in North India the Elgin mill was also started in 1860s. So there were many factories that were being established in India. So let's discuss about those factories. Now who were the capitalists about those industries, and who were working in those, and where did all the workers come from? Now let's discuss all these one by one with our subtopic, that is the early entrepreneurs. So the early entrepreneurs. Now you know what, that all these factories coming up in India, all that trade export from India through the industries started with the trade with China. As also you know that British in India were trading the opium with China, were exporting the opium from India to China, and were importing the tea from China to England. So there was a kind of trade triangle. Now British in India were exporting the opium to China, and China was exporting the tea to England for Britishers. So that was a trade with China, and with that trade there were many Indian juniors as well. Now there were many Indian juniors as well. Now they were providing finances, procuring ships, and all those consignments. So that was a work that was done by the Indian juniors. They were playing a role of juniors in all those trades, and having on through that trade, now they were seeing for developing the factories, developing the industries in India as well. Now they were saying they were now thinking of starting the factories in India as well, and that's why many industrialists now started to establish the factories in India, to establish their fortune in India. Like for example in 1830s, now there was Dwarkanath Tagore, who also traded with China. Now he came in India, and you could say they established companies, 6 joint stock companies in 1840s, around the time period of 1830s to 1840s. But as also we know that after that in 1840s there were economic crisis, and that's why all these enterprises sank along. But there were still many industrialists who came after him and were successful in India, like in Bombay, Jamshedji Tata, and many other people like Dinkonshi Pitit. So those all industrialists came in India through the through trading with China, and after that in India they became successful for their establishing all those factories. You can say that industries empires in India. Like as also know that you have already studied about the Jamshedji Tata. Now you know that TISCO, that was the Tata Iron and Steel Corporation organization, you could say that was established in India. So you could say that all those factories were being started by all those people who were earlier with the trade with China. Like for example Seth Hukumchand, who also did the work, who also traded, exported from India in the region of Kolkata, you know that Kanpur in the northern India. So there were still many industrialists who were doing the trade export from India. But you know what, that when all that company had established all that political power, and that's why all these industrialists had very much limitations, and all those European agencies were now controlling most of the biggest industries of India. Now 3 of the biggest were many, like Andrew Ule and Jardine Skin and Corporation. Many industries were now in the control of all those European agencies. Now you know what, that all these industrialists who had set up their you could say the industries or factories were now exporting with China, and you know that all those shipments and all those raw materials. But when there were limitations, they were only allowed to export export to Britain, England, all those raw materials and all those food crops. So you could say that their exports to Britain and many other countries were now limited because of the political power that had been gained by the company. Now what happened that in a company when there were a corporation or cooperation between the Britishers and the Indian industrialists. Now what would happen with that Indian industrialists, you could say that all those Indian industrialists were the capital investors. They invested all the capital in that factory, but all decisions were made by the Britishers, by British industrialists. So that was done by all those industrialists, and that's how factories came up in India. Now you could say that those were the early entrepreneurs. Now you could say that what happened was that there were still many Indian traders or Indian industrialists who weren't exporting, who were directly exporting to the other countries. Now in countries they were supporting financing or for the ship managements, but they weren't directly connected to the trade with export, or you could say to other countries. So that was the story of early entrepreneurs. Now you could say that many people were there, many industrialists were there, many famous industrialists. As all of you know that the father and the grandfather of the famous industrialist G.D. Birla also used to trade with China. So you could say that China also played an important role for the trade with India in the industries being set up in India. Now the question here is about the workers. So let's discuss about them with our next subtopic, that is, where did the workers come from? So where did the workers come from? Now here the question is that all factories have been set up, all industries have been set up, but what about the workers? Where did they came from? Where did they come from, you could say? Now you could say that all those workers came from the distant areas, from the neighboring areas, districts of all those cities. Like for example in Bombay, whenever there were mills that were being set up, around 50% of the workers or the man force were from the district that was you could say a near district, that was Ratnagiri. So you could say that from Ratnagiri there were 50% of the total workforce of that mill. So there were many people, many workers that were coming to the factories, to the industries, to the mills, all those that were being settled. Now they were from the distant areas. You could say that from near neighboring districts or from any other districts. So like for example, but still you know what, that also with the jobs, with employment, with getting opportunities, many people had to travel a long distance as well. You could say that for instance from United Province, from UP, you could say that many people travel to Bombay or Calcutta in search of jobs to get employed as a worker in those mills that were being set up. So you could say that all those that were being done, all those workers were from India, from the neighboring districts or from a very long distance. So they had to travel. But you could say that as there were very long demand of the workers, but still there was a lot of unemployment in our country because many workers were there and they weren't employed in those factories. As all of you know that there was a lot of employment demand of all those workers. Many factories were being set up, so much they needed all those workers, but still the number of workers was still in a very great proportion, and that's why many people didn't have any kind of job in any factories. Now they had to wait to get job in those factories or in those mills. So you could say that that was a job. Where did the workers come from? Now you know what, that there were limitations, restrictions on the employment of all those workers as well. Now what happened that all those industrialists employed a jobber. The work of the jobber was to recruit all the people, all the workers in the factory. Now obviously in most cases what happened that all those jobbers were old people and kind of a very old and trusted person. Now what he would do that from his village, all his known people who are looking for a job, he would recruit them in the factory, in the mills, and by doing that he would gain a kind of some authority or power, and that's why now he was demanding for gifts and you could say respect, and as you could say as a leader of all of them. So you could say that by doing that he was now sensing as he felt he was very powerful. So that is how workers, and where did the workers come in the factories? Now obviously they were from the neighboring areas, villages, or you could say all from the rural areas, because people went from rural areas to urban areas in search of jobs, to getting employed in those cotton mills, jute mills, or in any industries. Now our next topic is the peculiarities of industrial growth. So the peculiarities of the industrial growth. Now what was happening was now that all those European managing agencies were now looking for plantations in India, were now gaining interest in the tea and coffee plantations in India, and that's why they acquired land at a very cheap price from the British government that was ruling over India, and you could say that had plantations of tea and coffee in India. As also we know that in Darjeeling the finest quality of tea is produced all over the world. So you could say that that's why a lot of those agencies were now gaining interest in the plantations in India by gaining lands at a very cheap price and were now competing in the international market. Now you know what, that if we talk about the peculiarities of industrial growth, then there are many things that we have to discuss, you have to remember, you have to analyze about the industrial growth. Now you know what, that when all those Indian industries were being established in the 19th century, now they were, you could say that they weren't competing with those Manchester goods because they knew that they wouldn't be able to compete with those Manchester goods, and that's why they were looking at a different vision with a different point of view. Now they have seen that in the British market there wasn't any kind of role of yarn or the thread that much because the cloth was made, and that's why they now started to make, or you could say produce, all those yarn or the thread, you could say a very coarse type of yarn or thread. Now it was exported either to China or in the Indian market. Now many people were buying it, all those local weavers were also buying it for their handloom use. Now they were buying it to make their own produce. So you could say that earlier all those industries were now leaving the competition, were now escaping from the competition with all those Manchester goods, and that's why all those British industries were now dominating the Indian market as well as the international market. Now that was exported, all those Indian produce was exported either to China or was sold in India, but that also was declined in 1906. Now what happened that in 1906, now due to the Japanese produce and due to the Chinese produce, all that Chinese market was now flooding, and that's why that yarn couldn't be exported to China anymore, and that's why now Indian industries were now producing all those clothes, cotton cloth or the silk cloth or fabric, you could say. But earlier they weren't producing the fabric, they were producing the thread, but now they were producing the fabric, the cloth made out of it. So you could see that now that happened and many things were now growing. Now you could see that between the period of 1900 to 1912 all that cotton production doubled, but still till the First World War all the technological changes, all that industrial growth was very slow. It was only after the First World War and during the First World War that there was a very hectic change in the industrial growth. Now what happened that in the First World War, as I also know that Britain had to fight, and now it needed leader boats and all those that army uniforms and its equipments that was needed to be made in the industries, and that's the time when all the export from Britain fell in India. Now all those imports from Britain to India fell in India because Britain were now using that for their army for fighting in that war, and that gave the opportunities for the Indian industries. Now old ones were now they're multiplying their shifts, and now many new industries were also being settled in India, and that was the time when there were many workers who were employed in those industries as they were restricted by the British government to make the equipments or make the items for the war, for equipping the war, for giving the items to the war, to the armies, to the soldiers of Britain. Now that was a time when many workers had to do shift for a very long hours had to do very long hours work, you could say. And after that, when the First World War ended, now all those Britain companies could never recapture their domination, their power, their position in the Indian market, because all now Indian industrialists and all those local traders had now gained their position in the Indian market, as all those Britishers were busy in fighting that war, and that was a time that gave opportunities for all those Indian industrialists. Now our subtopic here is Small scale industries predominate. So small scale industries predominate. Now you know what, that industries were growing in India after First World War. Now Britain was never capable, you could say, was never capable to compete with US, Germany, or to hold its position in the Indian market, and that was when the industries were growing in India. But you know what, that those large scale production, those large scale industries were very low, very, you could say, less in number, less in percentage in India, and even in that 67% of all those large scale industries were just in Bengal and Bombay. Now you could say that all those small scale industries were predominant in our country in the 20th century. Now what happened, that you know that all those small scale industries, many workers were doing work in those small scale industries, in the workshops, in the, you could say, that weaving houses that were either in the alleys or in the by lanes, or you could say that were invisible by all those passerbys. Now what happened, that there was a very large proportion of small scale industries, small scale production in our country. Now as we have seen that in the 19th century, weavers had to face many problems, but despite that they survived in that condition, and now they were, you could say, that glowing, overcoming in the 20th century. How did this happen? Let's discuss about it. Now you know what, that even weavers of our country, even the local weavers of our country, were now taking the technological shifts. Not that much machines that were used in the mills, but now they were using a little bit technology in their work, you could say, so that their work will be in low time, less time, and there would be a kind of finding in that work, you could say, in that production. That because you know that technology increased the capability of per person, per worker, and that's why we were now using technology, but not that machines that were used in the cotton mills. Now what happened, that many of the handlooms were now connected, were now joined with the flash shuttles. Now flash shuttles, that was a device used for weaving, that was with the help of rope and pulleys. Now so that you could say that was a device, technological device used by the weavers in their handlooms. Now with that, you could say that by 1946 there were about 35% of all those handlooms that were present in India that were connected to flash shuttles. So that was a very great progress for those weavers, because now they were using the technological, this was partly because of the technological changes, technological shifts, you could say. Now what happened was that, as I've already said, that all those machines, cotton mills, could not imitate the design that was done by the hand, and that's why now many people were preferring to the weaver's work. As all of you know that many people obviously prefer to handmade clothes, as they are very fine, and you could say very fine woven, and you could say that those designs, specific designs, couldn't be made by any machines. And there were two types of weavers. There were two weavers, you could say. Now first, who were doing the coarse type of production, and second, those who were doing the fine type of production. Now first one, who were doing the coarse type of production, their production was bought by the poor people. As also know that those production will be less in income, less in cost, you could say, less expensive, and that's why all those people, poor people, would like to buy those coarse cloth, you could say. And the finer varieties of cloth was bought by the richer people of the Indian society. So you could say that in the times of famines, all those weavers who were producing the coarser clothes, their business was shut down, because you know that in the famines, in the poverty seasons, what would happen, that all those poor people wouldn't get to eat, and let alone just all those clothes, all those fine clothes, because they wouldn't get cash income. Their cash income would be increased to zero, and they wouldn't get anything to eat. So just let alone the idea of buying any clothes. But all those richer people wouldn't be affected by the famines that much, and that's why even in the famine situation, all those you could say expensive clothes like Banarsi sari or Baluchari sari were even still sold at a very large amount among the rich people. So that was the situation. You could say that all the small scale industries were now predominant in our country, as they were doing work by their hands and with the technological shifts, and were now gaining power in among the people. But still that didn't help any weaver to be prosperous. You could say that didn't help, because it took a lot of time for them to do the production, and and all those family members from children to men were now engaged in all stages of processes of each cloth, of production of clothes, and that's why it didn't make them that much prosperous, but still they weren't remnants of the past growing of factories. Now they were integral part of the industrialization. So that was the story of 20th century of weavers. You could say that they now had overcome their remnants of the past life, of past growing of industrialization. So that is about the peculiarities of the industrial growth. We have seen what were the changes. Now we have seen about the weavers as well. Now our next and last topic of this chapter is market for goods. So market for goods. Now you know what, that for all goods to be sold in the market, what is the most important thing? Obviously the mindset of the people. We have to make their mindset as like that they would buy all those goods of those companies, of those industries, and for doing so the most important thing is the advertisements. Now today we say that in the newspapers, in magazines, in TV screens, in the streets, in walls, the advertisements of different products, different items of different companies, industries, you could say. But even at that time, even the colonial government, even by the Britishers, all those advertisements were being used, not in the television screens or devices, but in the calendars, in the newspapers and magazines, and in the clothes. Now they were doing many type of advertisements so that there would be more spreading of those clothes, of all those items, products that were produced by the Britishers among the people. Now first was that advertisement of the Britishers that were labeling their clothes. Now all those bundle of clothes were labeled as a made in Manchester, and that was expected to be confident in buying, so that when people saw it they would be confident in buying that, because it would be written as made in Manchester. That just gave a kind of that thought to the people. And there wasn't just written that made in Manchester. There were many, you could say, figures of Indian gods, goddess, and that made people even more confident to buy that cloth. So there were many types of advertisements, and most of them were like that, figures of gods and goddess like Krishna, Saraswati, or anything. You could say that any god or goddess in any calendar, because you know that even in the poor houses there would be calendar as much as in the apartments or any offices, because during that time there weren't any kind of devices or phones that we use today for seeing the dates, and that's why during that time calendar was very important for each person, and that's why you could say that in calendars there would be the figures of gods and goddess and products. Now it would be showing that it would, you know what, that the purity of gods and goddess, Indian gods and goddess, is taken as the most top priority of the people, and that's why when the products were shown as a god and goddess were using them, and you know that the advertisement, this promotion of all those products by all those figures, now people would just buy those items, products. Now you know what, that figure like god, goddess of India like Krishna or Saraswati were shown in different types of products, or even the historical great kings that had won many wars or many, you could say, fights, and that's why in many battles who had won many battles, those kings were also shown in the advertisements. Like you know what, that in advertisements there would be a parade of king, and they would be going wearing that cloth that was made by the Britishers, and all those products would be shown as being used by that king. So that you could say that the quality of product couldn't be questioned by the local people of our country, as they had respect towards those gods and goddess and towards all those kings, their historical kings or queens. So that was the process of advertisements by the Britishers. But what about the Indian industrialists? Now Indian industrialists didn't have that much, you could say that didn't have to do that much in the advertisement. They just would write that if you are a true Indian, if you are a true nationalist, then buy this Indian produce, and then their just production would be sold into the market, because the nationalist feeling among the people was very high. Now people wanted freedom from the Britishers, and that's why you could say that's why all those things were happening. And even after the Swadeshi movement, you know that in Swadeshi movement all those foreign items were boycotted. That gave opportunities to the that Indian industrialists even more and more, and even Indian weavers as well. Now you know that when Swadeshi movement started, all those concessions were being demanded by the industrialists, that all concessions goods should be given to them, and there should be a very great tariff production. Now tariff was you could say a kind of tax that was levied by the government of India, or you could say British government of India, on the exports and imports of all those goods or items. So that you could say that they wanted tariff production and many more things. So you could say that was a market for goods, how the market was seen for the goods. Now most important was the advertisements. Even without advertisement, the selling of all those goods would be like impossible. So that is about the market for goods. Now last and least, you could say that lastly we are going to discuss about the conclusion of this chapter. Now the conclusion of this chapter, what do you see? Now in this chapter we have seen that there was a very great industrial growth, great industrial change, but still the handwork and all those workshops, weavers were still in those industrialization. You know what, that all this handwork and hand labor was still respected as compared to that of process of industrialization, the technology, because people wanted that much the good quality. So that we have seen in this chapter, that not just technology or industries were brought up, but also hand labor and all those handmade items were also in that process. So this is about this chapter. Now just think about those two figures that we have discussed in the starting of this chapter, like the dawn of the century and the two magicians. Now do you think that how much is the reality in that figures and how much is a fake, you could say? Now just think about it yourself. It is your conclusion, it would be your conclusion. So this is all we have discussed in this chapter. Now in this chapter we have seen from the British perspective. In Britain we have seen how the industries were growing, and we have seen from the Indian perspective as well. Now we have seen about many industrialists that were setting, like the jute mill that was started in Bengal, in the region of Bengal in 1917. So you could say that there were many things that were growing and industries growing, but still on the other hand there was hand labor, hand workers or weavers that were still being their work was still being sold into the markets to the people. So this is all we have discussed in this chapter. I've discussed all topics and subtopics, and the remaining last chapter of this book will be covered in the further upcoming video. So thank you very much.